The short version would run something like this. The disputes are many, and principally, obviously, between the claimants to the Spratly Islands and to a lesser extent the Paracel Islands, which involves China, Taiwan, as Jonathan said, but also 4 of the ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Brunei, Philippines, and Malaysia. The risks are very considerable, I believe, and increasing. This is an arena where there have been clashes in the past, principally between China and Vietnam, although more recently a standoff between the Philippines and China. And it's also an area where, if you like, the 2 great powers, the United States and China, are increasingly active. China for the obvious reasons. The US, although it had never turned its back on Asia and the Pacific, far from it, has become, or is trying to be, more assertive through the pivot towards Asia. Finally, there's the diplomacy. And that's, if you like, the rub of the matter, because it seems to me there is not very much diplomacy. But why are these issues becoming more vexed and bitter in recent times? I think there are several reasons. One is economic factors. All the claimants believe that this area, the South China Seas, and particularly around the Spratlys, this area is rich in oil and gas deposits, and all are anxious to pursue oil and gas exploration there. Another economic reason is the fact that the coastal waters of so many of these countries are becoming exhausted from fishing, and fishing fleets are having to go out further to sea.
The islands themselves, particularly the Spratly Islands, are not of very much military strategic utility. And in fact, in the early 20th century, both the UK and France had some form of claim to these islands, and the UK in particular dropped its claims because they didn't see them as useful. It's only when Japan started moving into the area that the UK was suddenly a lot more interested. So yes, I think dominance of the South China Sea, turning it into a Chinese lake, which is a controversial topic, but having almost entirely Chinese hegemony over the South China Sea is of great strategic utility because it allows China direct access and unfettered access to the Strait of Malacca, which is its main route to the Indian Ocean. It must use the South China Sea to access the Pacific to some extent at the moment, or its best route is to the Pacific through the Luzon Strait at the moment as well. So there are a number of naval and strategic reasons why this is happening. And this is why we see the construction of a major new naval base on Hainan Island on the south coast.
And there's a scramble amongst ASEAN countries to buy submarines from South Korea, from France, from Germany, and from Sweden.
There is an unprecedented armament process going on in East Asia generally, and to some extent in Southeast Asia. There was a huge procurement of arms in Southeast Asia in the late 80s, early 90s, which was curtailed by the Asian financial crisis in 97. There was much talk then of a regional arms race in Southeast Asia, and proponents for and against this concept. Again, there's now talk of an arms race in East Asia generally. And I think that's largely because of the action-reaction dynamic we see in some armament procurements in the region. Lord Williams mentioned the submarines. Submarines are very useful vessels to have. They are necessarily clandestine. They add an element of surprise. They are huge sea denial capabilities and force multipliers that allow you to deny large areas of the sea just by having one submarine and the element of doubt. And these are certainly being purchased because Vietnam can no longer compete with China's much more superior surface fleet in the South Sea Fleet. So there is that evidence of action-reaction dynamics and therefore this theory of an arms race. But other procurements don't necessarily follow the same line or aren't necessarily related to China's rise.
Let me turn then perhaps finally to the diplomacy, of which, as I said, there's not very much. And this has been hindered further by the crisis within ASEAN in developing a common position following the Phnom Penh summit. It's not easy to see a diplomatic path going forward. Indonesia has thought of playing that role, but Indonesia's position is far more akin to and sympathetic to its fellow members of ASEAN. The International Crisis Group, in a recent paper on the region, suggested a troika of ASEAN ministers. But that also doesn't seem to me to be a formula that will work, and would certainly not be one that would be attractive to Beijing.
The use of paramilitaries rather than gunboats themselves is useful, particularly for China, for three main reasons I would point out. One is that, given that they're unarmed, they necessarily demilitarize the situation, and they don't allow any kind of possibility of escalation up the military ladder. If you have two warships out in the sea on their own, out of contact with their political leaders back home, things can go very awry very quickly. But with maritime paramilitaries, that is less likely to happen. Secondly, they're a very useful way for China to reinforce their claim of sovereignty. They act as a kind of de facto sovereignty claim in and of themselves, even though they have no reference to de jure sovereignty over these areas. The sending of a maritime paramilitary vessel is like sending a police car to a village in a disputed border area. By having the police car there, it demonstrates that you must have sovereignty over this area. Why else would you police it? It doesn't have any legal basis, but it's a very useful physical presence to retain.
Michael Wesley of the Lowy Institute in Sydney has suggested that Australia could play a role in trying to broker a solution to what is becoming a more bitter dispute. But again, given Australia's close alliance relationship with the US, it's unlikely to be seen by Beijing as a neutral broker. That doesn't leave many other possibilities. One that I would put forward is what's called in the Charter of the UN the good offices of the Secretary General. That this might be something that could be used. It has been in the past. The UN played a role, for example, during the time of Pérez de Cuellar's Secretary Generalship in assisting with the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan way back in 1989. I think that ASEAN countries would be sympathetic to such a UN role, but it would remain to be a tough sell with China. But as time goes on, I believe China will find it uncomfortable having difficult relationships with ASEAN countries, the Asian countries that are on its doorstep, and hopefully may look to more benignly at diplomatic solutions.
Nonetheless, conflict does seem very improbable in the region at the moment for a variety of reasons. One is the potential cost of the conflict, both in terms of blood and treasure. The other is that I'm not sure what a military operation would look like in the South China Sea currently. Lord Williams mentioned 1974 and the taking of the Paracel Islands, 1988, which is China's first entry into the Spratly Islands and its creation of fortifications there. But now, for China to launch any kind of operation against the various claimants in the Spratly Islands will be increasingly complex. I'm not sure what they would gain out of it. They would have to take 30 to 40 installations in a very short period of time. They would then have to occupy those installations and reinforce them. And they would be dealing with 4 different entities at the same time. So I don't really know what an operation would look like from China's point of view. And finally, there's also the presence of the US and the pivot to Asia, which, although very modest in the number of forces, is very clearly directed towards China. So I would argue that, and this is in slight contrast to what Lord Williams has said, that the use of maritime paramilitaries is a tacit signal by China and other states that avenues of diplomacy are still open, and we're not inevitably heading towards some kind of conflict between these various states, even while they arm themselves for the insurance policy of having the armaments.